Thank you all very much for attending the last session of the day before the Impact Awards. Does that make us the headline act or the graveyard session? I'm not so sure. But I'm Katja Sarmiento-Mirwaldt. I'm the Vice Dean for Research for the newly formed College of Arts, Law and Social Sciences. And I am joined here today by three colleagues from that college. Neveen Abdalla, Senior Lecturer in Intelligence, Defense and Security. Stephen Wagner, Senior Lecturer in International Security, and Shona Paterson, who is the Director of the Research Center for Global Lives. And Stephen and Neveen are also representing the Brunel Center for Intelligence and Security Studies. And the topic for today is the rather mystifying title, The Global Goldfish Bowl, Satellite Technology, Information and Power. So just to clarify what we mean by this, maybe I can turn to Neveen as the first person. Neveen, help us out. The metaphor, the global goldfish bowl, what do we mean by that?
So the global goldfish bowl is essentially the idea that if you are a person in a goldfish bowl, you can see out as much as somebody can see in. And so it's very clear what people are doing on either side of the goldfish bowl. If we take that into a global perspective and apply it to commercial satellite imagery or any sort of technology, it's the idea that we can see what everybody is doing, whether it's positive or negative, but conversely, everybody can also see our actions in equal and opposite measure.
And what does that have to do with satellite technology?
It opens up the understanding that whether you are trying to use open source commercial satellite imagery or other satellite imagery, it makes it known that people can see what you're doing, and likewise you can see what other people are doing, and there are positives and negative aspects to that, which I think we'll probably end up touching on later, so I don't want to step on my toes.
Can I perhaps turn to Stephen then? So what sort of things are satellites teaching us about human behavior that might interest an intelligence or a security scholar or social scientists more generally?
Well, I think the headline issue here, certainly in recent days, if not years, has been the use of commercial satellites and more. I'm looking at, in particular, the Russian war in Ukraine, and looking also at Israel's war in Gaza, where regular people, journalists and others can use satellites to investigate what's happening and get closer to the truth despite like official reports and this sort of thing, and where combatants can use this material to identify targets, locate them and destroy them. So I'm thinking in particular of the attack on the Russian Air Force this past week, where these drones, as they're flying in, you can see on the Russian wings of the plane these tires that are set up to fool American and British AI systems meant to identify aircraft from loads and loads of satellite data. Somehow the Ukrainians got to the right place anyway and managed to identify those targets anyhow. So this is, from the center's point of view anyway, this has been the headline topic.
Okay. Well, let's move on to another center. I'm sure Shona has some things to add on the sorts of things that satellite technology can show us and give us information on.
Absolutely. I mean, I know nothing about war, thankfully, but certainly from a different type of combat situation or crisis, we look at climate change and think about sort of the way that satellite images can help us develop early warning systems for major hazards that are used in different settings. It provides all sorts of satellite data are used in urban planning, for instance, really trying to think about different ways of reinventing spaces that humans use in terms of the distribution of humanitarian aid. If a disaster hit area is being flooded or landslides have occurred in certain areas, satellites will allow different types of vehicles to be able to use different areas based on that satellite data. So I think there's a really important structure in terms of how satellites are used for good in that sort of way. I think it also brings up a really interesting juxtaposition around sort of this negative or sort of access to satellite data that I'm sure my panel colleagues will be much better placed to talk about, and how marginalised communities or communities who perhaps maybe don't have access, or the same access as the global north do, how that satellite data is being distributed or accessed or not, the case may be, is a really interesting debate.
Yeah, that is a question that occurred to me as Neveen was elaborating on the goldfish bowl metaphor, that it means you can both see and be seen. If what we see is information, and information is the sort of truism is power, then who's actually empowered by this technology and the information that it brings us? I'll maybe throw this one right back at Shona and then come back to my BC's colleagues.
That's a very interesting question. I don't think I have a clear answer, but I think there is a huge debate around sort of the harm that satellite data are doing, or sort of the new access to satellite data having in terms of indigenous communities, who all of a sudden are being exposed to the global world in a way that they haven't been before, and then people are using satellite data to understand the resources that they have or don't have in certain cases, and therefore the areas that indigenous communities have been using for centuries suddenly are becoming under attack from extractionist types of activities. And that's something not entirely new, but certainly has been something that has been building in terms of pressure on differently marginalised communities that certainly without satellite data we wouldn't know what's in the middle of the Amazon, really, to be honest. But now we do. And so there are dollar signs attached to every resource that we have on this planet, and it makes those at times very difficult to access resources much more tangible and much more monetarizable. Is that even a word? It is now.
It's now.
It's now.
Trademarked.
Thank you.
You were nodding vigorously there at one point.
I was. One of the things that I've been working on is looking at, for those of you who are familiar with the concept of galamsey, which is illicit mining in Western
Sorry, what was that?
Galamsey.
Galamsey?
Yes. It's the concept of illicit mining in Western Africa, and you can use Earth observation software to identify where these illegal mines are. And what we've been doing is, number one, identifying whether the extraction is actually harming the area around the galamsey because of minerals that are or chemicals that are being used to wash off the gold. They're going downstream, and subsequent effects that it has on the land. And so there's a positive use in understanding where that galamsey is happening, but also, while you're looking at galamsey, we can also identify illicit trade and smuggling networks that are linked to terrorist organizations. And so there's this double-edged benefit. It's not a double-edged sword if it's both beneficial, but for us it's quite useful. At the same side, though, is that if a corporation is interested in knowing where to mine or where to extract resources, all they have to do is look at the same observations and identify where the galamsey is, and then buy a license for that plot of land. So it can go either way.
So how do we envisage this information empowering then bad actors that you've been alluding to? How dangerous is this in comparison to the sort of information that, say, bad actors had access to previously, before this technological innovation? Maybe I can ask Stephen that.
Sure. So I think my response would be that this technology being cheap and widely available has democratized this level of surveillance in a way that's completely unprecedented. So if you go back 40 years, only the United States had real-time satellite imagery beaming down from orbit into some command center where the imagery could be interpreted. Whereas, and others caught up very quickly, but it was exclusive to rich states. Where today, basically anyone, including these smugglers, can be using the same technology to cover their tracks, to watch police forces, border forces, to evade them, to attack them. So suddenly it becomes possible for smaller, weaker groups who are more poorly armed to direct those weapons really, really effectively.
If I can add one line to this. This is what we're seeing in maritime piracy in the Malacca Straits and in the Gulf of Guinea, where these groups may not have a lot of resources, but they have access to the internet. And they can use that internet, and they can use Earth observation software to identify ship movements and go out to those ships and target them. And so they're using it for their own purposes for free to conduct piracy attacks every week.
And I don't want to say that all the satellite data is harmful and
No,
only
no.
bad actors are out there accessing it. And picking up on shipping, for instance, we did some work in the Caribbean with small ships that don't have GPS units on them, and you can actually, as sort of government entities, actually track those small boats. And so if they don't come back to harbour, there is a maritime safety element to this. Yeah. So there is that pro and con in terms of, yes, pirates are absolutely using it, but governments are also, or Coast Guard are also using it as a safety element to be able to locate, especially smaller boats that may be caught up in large hurricanes or storms or different weather patterns that maybe they weren't expected at the time. So there is this, especially at sea, there is this really quite neat juxtaposition of good and bad actors using exactly the same data, accessing those data in exactly the same way, but for very, very different purposes.
What about us as researchers? What can we do with this data? What new research avenues are opening up here? What new collaborations? I'm going to head straight back to Shona, actually, and give that to her.
Yeah, I mean, I sometimes feel like we are now so reliant on satellite data that the first thing we do is, how do I write satellite data into my grant? And I kind of get a bit scared of that, especially as sort of a climate scientist and as a social scientist as well. I think there's a large push to make use of all sorts of satellites out there. You look at the weather data and the climate data that are generated by Copernicus, for instance. It's real time. It's amazing. There are gigabytes of data that are produced every day. And so the sort of the avenues to conduct very high-tech research exists, but in exactly the same way as a lot of the other panels have spoken about today. It's that social, either social buy-in into those data or the social behavioural change that perhaps maybe those data may be able to generate. So if we're looking at different types of flood defences or something along those sort of lines, do communities want those flood defences in place? Do they want wind turbines that you can map sort of wind patterns off satellite data? Those sorts of things are much more accessible now in terms of the research that we're able to do. But eventually it comes down to what humans are actually going to do with this stuff that I think is a really interesting element that we shouldn't forget within our research.
Same with AI.
Yeah, absolutely.
My only experience using this kind of data is actually for historical research. So my book, I compared satellite data with archival materials to map out British security construction in Palestine during the 1930s and 40s. And one of the big insights in that was when you overlay all the roads and fortresses that they built in the country over top the first Arab-Israeli War in 1948, see most of the major battles and expulsions of Palestinians take place in areas where there are high concentrations of these forts. It's a very clear indicator that the war was fought over stuff that Britain had built and then abandoned.
Is it okay?
Go, of course.
In the intelligence world, we refer to all of this as geospatial intelligence or imagery intelligence, and so a lot of the research is focused on, various applications. And imagery intelligence has been around since the Civil War. People would go up in hot air balloons and they'd take pictures of, what was beyond the hills and things like that. And so, from an intelligence perspective, it's not that the foundation has changed. It's just that it's gotten a lot, we went from the typewriter to, the computer. So it's in some ways the same foundation, but it is one of a multiple component of channels that we would use. And so I would say it's an adjunct to research in a sense, is that it's one component that on its own can tell a story, but that story is made so much stronger in terms of research when we're looking at different channels of gathering information, whether we're using it to identify smuggling tunnels that are happening between, as claimed by the United States and Mexico, if we're looking at it to see runoff of mineral wash in the Philippines or something like that, we can use the observation software to tell a story, but that story cannot be told just with the use of Earth observation software. And so that's why it's an adjunct to research rather than the whole thing, if that makes sense.
I did actually want to come back to precisely this point, because even a departed colleague of ours used satellite GIS data to take electricity use, for example, as a proxy for public spending, or mapping the terrain as an indicator of the likelihood of conflict. This data arises from technology that is as zoomed out as it can be, no? What is the role then, given that all this information is now available at our fingertips, ready for mapping, ready for analysis? In such a situation, what is the role for that really zoomed in research, fieldwork research, talking to people, potentially visiting places that you're interested in, archives, if you like? Will the role of that diminish, or what do you predict?
I mean, I can give you a very tangible example of work that we were doing in Brazil, in Santos, and we had Landsat data, we had satellite data in order to be able to look at the impacts of different hazards on climate change and what adaptation efforts might be made. And then we actually did the site visit and realised that the satellite data were completely off. They hadn't been ground truthed. And we were looking at sort of at least 10 metres difference in sort of depth of water going through some of the favelas in Santos. And, I mean, 10 metres, it's either there or it's not. I mean, that is a brutal difference. And so I think there is still very much that real-time ground truth that's needed. I think there's a reliance on technology. We all, we have satellite data on our phone. Let's be honest. If anybody looks at Google Earth, it's so accessible that we forget that there is something very real about needing to make sure that those data are as accurate as they can be, especially if we're in life and death situations, as you two are often sort of working in.
We have a researcher in the department now who is actually looking at the effects of oil contamination in the Gulf of Guinea. And you can definitely use Earth's observation software to see the extent in certain regions across the different states that are affected. But the field research that he conducted, he spoke to the corporations who were responsible. And he also spoke to focus groups of citizens that were living in the area and who were at first very unwilling to speak because they thought it would go nowhere and they were sick of talking. But he was able to break through that barrier and had people showing him pictures of their feet, or even showing him their actual feet where the skin has come off because of walking through the sand in these areas. That is not something that Earth observation software can show. That is not a story that we can see from space. And so we cannot afford to lose the art of talking to people and hearing their stories.
Okay, we have only about 6 minutes left. We want to stop promptly at 4 for the Impact Awards. So I'm now going to ask the audience if a couple of you maybe have any questions to ask Neveen, Stephen, or Shona. Yes, we have a question right there. Gentleman on my left.
Thank you. Could you say something more about power and control of satellites? Who owns space? Who owns privacy? And, the fundamentals of life are now, such as telling the time or geolocation, are determined by satellites. So it's quite important.
Stephen, maybe?
Maybe I'll start, sure. I think there's two issues here that you highlight. One is a resilience challenge. that we've become so dependent on these systems that, in fact, if they were to be unavailable to us suddenly, I think a lot of people wouldn't know how to cope. I wonder sometimes how people who've never actually held a physical map in their hand would manage in that situation. So that's my first response. I think in terms of the privacy, what I talk to my students about on this topic, in our MA Intelligence course, I teach the history module, and one of the things we discuss is how attitudes towards privacy have changed over time, and also how the laws surrounding privacy has changed over time. Technology is a huge driver of these changes, but we're living through a paradox where, as privacy is being encroached upon from every direction, people also seem to care less and less about it. So the example I like to give is I was out for drinks with my former supervisor a few years ago, and during a bathroom break I noticed that on top of the urinal there was an ad with a QR code with a link to a website. And I thought, in no other place or time would it ever be appropriate to whip out a camera in this situation, right? But people just, this is normal suddenly, right? So this is the paradox, or an illustration of it that I think we're living through. Go ahead.
It's a great
I don't know how to top that.
So did we answer the question on who owns these satellites?
Who owns the satellites? Well, that's a huge, maybe I'll leave that to you.
Do you want to go
Oh
first?
no, please.
Oh, I mean, commercial
interested.
satellites. I guess there's two speeds, right? There's the government speed and there's the commercial speed. The government ones are usually higher resolution. They've got more capabilities. But what we find, especially in the United States in the past couple of months, is that they're opening the door for a lot more commercial satellite access. And one of the reasons for that is that it offers them cover. So even if they find something amazing or very important on the government satellites, they can say, well, we got it through commercial satellite systems, and it allows them cover and open source information access so that they can say that they got it overtly rather than covertly, for example. So I think the majority of satellites out there are commercial. There is a significant threat of those being scrambled because I don't think anybody in this room knows how to use an abacus. Or, I don't anyway. But it is overwhelmingly and increasingly a commercial space where governments are starting to rely more and more on those commercial satellite systems.
And I think that brings up a lot of fear in a lot of people, especially when you look at certain actors around this world right now and the sheer amount of money and power that is being sort of pushed into a few global players and a few global commercial entities. And that brings up a lot of questions around who owns those data and how those data are used for commercial purposes versus non-commercial purposes. And I think that's really where the sort of debate of power within satellite work and research is really going. And I think those questions really haven't been properly addressed for quite a lot of reasons. Go on.
No, it just reminded me, everybody's used Google Street View, I imagine, at some point. And Google Street View used to be very cautious about not showing where military locations were. They couldn't get into places like North Korea to see what was going on. And so the evolution of these satellites, I mean, I suppose if we want to see into North Korea, we can now. That's a good thing. But at the same time, it's also showing us a lot of places that have been deliberately kept private. We don't necessarily want people to know where their nuclear facilities are and things like that too. So there's the privacy of the government to keep in mind as well. Secrecy, if you will.
So far from apologizing for your question, you've actually spawned a little debate here. Thank you very much for that. I would love to give you a chance to ask another, but I'm afraid we are approaching 4 o'clock, so I'll bring this to a close now. Thank you very much, colleagues from CALS, from BCs, and from Global Lives for contributing to this debate. I think other pockets of the university also work on this topic, so we are open to collaborating on this. Thanks very much, Neveen, Stephen, and Shona, and thank you also to the audience.